The Monster Guys podcast begins now.
Welcome to the Monster Guys podcast. As always, I'm DC McGannon, and I'm here with C. Michael McGannon. Michael, we are rolling into February 2016. Can you believe that we're already 2 months into the new year?
It's, you know what? This has been, not this month, but January has been a long month, and at the same time, it feels like time has just flown by. So it's been kind of a weird, timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly Doctor Who scenario.
Yeah, wow. You just said all of that off the top of your head. That's impressive. What? Timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly, Dr. Seussy. Is that what you said?
No, Doctor Who. It's a Doctor Who quote.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, but it was just impressive that you just rolled that off your tongue without incident.
You want me to do the full quote?
Go ahead, go for it.
Okay, time is not a timeline. It's more of a wibbly-wobbly ball of timey-wimey stuff. I'm sure I butchered that, but that's the idea of it.
Okay. Well, it seems just like yesterday we were steamrolling through Thanksgiving, Christmas, and the New Year, and here we are into February. And we have a very special month in store for this month on the Monster Guys podcast.
Yes, we do.
We are discussing yokai and Japanese culture for the entire month of February, and I am pumped about these topics that we have lined up for the next few weeks.
I am super excited. This is, we reference Irish culture a lot, we reference Scandinavian culture a lot, and we also reference Japanese culture a lot when talking about universal archetypes or concepts on monsters. And there's a lot to draw from in the Japanese mythology and Japanese folklore. And tonight, we get to interview somebody who is very knowledgeable and who has lived in that culture.
Yeah, you're right. And something that people don't know about us, maybe, is that when we go to conventions and we do live shows and special events, a lot of times we do presentations on yokai. Yokai in the form of storytelling, sometimes in relation to the books that we write, and sometimes just an overview conversation about yokai and Japanese culture. But we enjoy the topic of yokai and Japanese culture, like to take a little bit of that with us everywhere we go. So being able to devote some time here on the Monster Guys podcast is just right up our alley and very exciting for us to do. And you're right, tonight we have a very special guest, somebody I consider an expert that you introduced me to several years ago by way of his art. And I'm not going to say his name yet because I'm going to let you introduce him in just a moment, but he's an artist, he's an author, and somebody, like you said, who has lived in country for an extended period of time in Japan and has immersed himself into that culture and is very much an expert on this topic. One of the other things, though, before we get to that interview is the announcement that we are going to begin a podcast devoted to yokai from the Monster Guys podcast.
This will be, at least starting out for now, a short and sweet series of episodes telling you stories in the Monster Guys way about yokai and other Japanese monsters and spooky, creepy, crawly creatures.
Yeah, and what we're going to do right off the bat is add an extra episode to our weekly episodes. They'll be shorter, like 5, 10, maybe 15 minutes, and they will be a story and what we call a case file about yokai. And I don't know if that's the best word for it, but we're going to basically reference a specific yokai by way of storytelling from folklore, mythology, based in Japanese culture. So very excited about that, and we do have a couple of other things that'll be coming in the near future from the Monster Guys related to yokai and Japanese culture. We'll tip you off about those things as soon as they are ready to rock and roll.
All very exciting announcements.
Oh my gosh, I'm just, my head is spinning because of what we are rolling out in 2016. Not only from the sheer magnitude of it and how exhausted I'm going to be come December from this year, but just the excitement about all the really cool things that are coming our way from the Monster Guys, both in the live version of who we are and in the podcast and in a couple of other surprises that we'll have popping up here in the next couple of months. But tonight, let's kick off our discussion of yokai. We're going to discuss with our special mystery guest a general discussion about yokai, but mixed in there, we're also going to go specific to the grouping of yokai called the Tsukumogami. So there's just going to be a lot of discussion, and for people who are fans of yokai, I know one of the things we came away with this is some clarification on some definition of yokai and some of the elements of folklore and mythology and relevance to the Japanese people. So Michael, why don't you introduce for us our guest tonight, and then we're going to switch over to our interview with him.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for us to speak with Matthew Meyer.
DC McGannon and Michael here, the Monster Guys, getting the rare privilege of speaking with Matthew Meyer, who is a Japanese culture expert and yokai expert. Matthew, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This is really exciting for us. A lot of conventions and stuff we go to, we actually reference your work quite a lot, and we consider you to be a modern-day folklorist.
Well, thank you very much.
And, you know, I'm just continually astounded by your artwork. I know I sent you some questions to discuss about yokai and everything, and maybe I can just throw a little ad-lib out there and ask you about your art. How do you create as an artist when you create this style of art? Because it is so rich and dynamic. It really pops, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Every piece that you produce is just so incredibly unique, and it has this classic feel. If you look at classic Japanese art, it's reminiscent of that, but yet it is very much a modern piece of art. How do you come about creating this style of art?
I guess it's pretty simple as to how most people do it. I start with a sketch. There's a lot of research into the references and the background images that I'll use, but I'm glad you noticed that it is reminiscent of older Japanese art, because a lot of my influence comes from that, especially when I'm working with illustrations of yokai. You know, there's not too many modern-day depictions of things like that, so a lot of what I'm looking at as source material is paintings that were painted hundreds of years ago or more. So using that as a base, and then working in my sketchbook, I usually pencil out a design and then ink it on a Wacom tablet and then paint it there.
Which I love. That's, like you said, there's not a lot to go on for older yokai, or older illustrations of yokai, so it's awesome to get to see something colorful and fully formed when a lot of those older paintings are very, in a very cool way, they're a little minimalistic.
Yeah, and of course over time a lot of them have degraded, and also you can see them as on a screen because there's not really original copies that are available to most people. So it's nice to have a print or a book that's a little bit more tangible to look at. So I think that's something that's fun about the paintings that I do.
Absolutely. Matthew, we know you as an artist, as an author. We know you as Japanese culture and yokai expert. You have got your hands in a lot of projects, doing a lot of really cool things. Take just a moment and tell us about yourself, who you are, where you come from, kind of what you're into now, and just kind of give us an idea of who Matthew Meyer is.
I don't know if that's that interesting, but yeah, I grew up in South Jersey, went to college in Florida, Sarasota, Florida, at Ringling College of Art and Design. I think I had a pretty ordinary childhood. I was a bit of a nerd. I was always interested in science fiction, fantasy, folklore, and history, and things like that. So those are always influences in my life. While I was in college, I did a summer homestay program in Japan, and that's where I kind of first fell in love with not just the culture and the language, but the art as well. I think one of the biggest things that struck me while I was over there was just how graphic of a country Japan is and how they've got a really strong sense of design and artistic qualities. After that trip, I decided that I really wanted to go back. So after graduation, I did what a lot of people do, got a job as an English teacher in Japan, and sort of use that as an excuse to learn more about the country and particularly the artwork and the other things that I was interested in, such as mythology and folklore. And that's sort of where I fell into yokai as well.
And you've devoted quite a bit of your career to yokai, to illustrating and writing about yokai. Is that correct?
Yeah, probably most of my career at this point.
Going to Japan, that had to be a really interesting experience, especially the first time around. What can you tell us, other than what you've already said, about your experience in Japan, either as a student or a teacher or an illustrator, and especially coming from from America going to Japan, how were you received? How did you kind of infiltrate that culture and become a part of it? Tell us a little bit about that.
The first time I went, it was just a really fantastic experience. It was a homestay program, so I stayed with a family in Japan, and it was in a rural part of Japan, so not like Tokyo or a big city. It was kind of a small countryside, so I really got to feel the local culture more than the globalized culture that you'll find in big cities. And we spent the mornings doing language lessons and then the afternoons doing cultural excursions. But that kind of immersive homestay experience was such a wonderful way to experience a different culture. I would recommend it to anybody who's interested in visiting a foreign country.
And you speak the language now? Are you pretty fluent?
I do now. When I first got there, I only knew, a handful of phrases. And, there's that really fish out of water feeling when you land in an airport and you have to figure out how to get yourself, 8 hours across the country to the other side without any knowledge of what to do.
Yeah.
But Japan's a really safe and friendly country and easy to navigate, so it was far easier than I had thought it would be.
From what I understand nowadays, if I remember reading correctly on your blog, you actually have translated a lot of folktales over to English for your own work.
Yeah, well, part of the reason that I started writing about yokai was that there was no information about them at all in English when I started writing. Here was this aspect of Japanese culture that I'd never even heard about, and particularly since I'd been interested in folklore and mythology for my whole life, this was something that I was surprised that I'd never even heard of. So I started researching into it, and now there's a few books, including my own, that are written on yokai, but there's still a very small amount of information written in English. So I try to find yokai that people have never heard about and stories that people have never heard and translate them and just present them to the English-speaking world.
Yeah, and you probably have no shortage of yokai to speak about. If I'm not mistaken, there are well over 5,000 or 6,000 different creatures within the world of yokai. Am I correct?
Yeah, there's countless. I couldn't even tell you how many that I've come across, but I keep a running list as I'm researching, and anytime I see a name that I'm not familiar with, I'll write it down there, and then at some point in the future I'll go back through the list. But that's kind of how I gather my to-do list of which yokai I'm going to look up in the future.
So as many years as you've been doing this, you're still discovering new yokai?
All the time, yeah.
Wow.
That's really exciting, actually.
It's funny because it's this rabbit hole that just never ends, but it's a very fun rabbit hole.
That is very cool. Now, just for the sake, because I'm gonna flip our questions around here for just a moment. Our discussion for the month of February on our podcast is centered around yokai and Japanese culture. You are our first guest for the first podcast in February on this topic. So just for the sake of definition, for any listeners who may not be familiar with yokai or Japanese creatures or folklore, can you give us some form of definition that we can work with when we say yokai? What are we talking about?
It's a pretty vague concept, really. The word is made up of kanji that mean strange and mysterious thing. So it's sort of a catch-all phrase for all of the paranormal and supernatural in Japan. Although if you ask different people, you'll get different definitions. Some of them are more precise or more vague, but I think you can sort of use it as a catch-all for all of folkloric monsters and spirits from Japan.
So are yokai just monsters, or are they also events or experiences that people have?
They can be events and experiences, supernatural phenomenon. That includes things like mysterious fires floating in the sky or sleep paralysis. Back before modern medicine was in Japan, people used to blame mental illness and other sicknesses on evil spirits, so you can even kind of include sickness in the yokai category.
Which is a common theme globally in many countries, how evil spirits or things that we can't explain or can't put our finger on, we're always to blame, for sickness or evil things that have happened within a tribe or a community. So kind of the same thing, but the all-encompassing phrase is yokai in Japan.
Yes.
Would you say that is... I kind of feel like that can be shown in the way that household items even come to life, and kind of get spirits of their own. Is that kind of the same thought process that stems to that, or is that something completely different?
Yeah, so you're talking about Tsukumogami, which is a subgenre of yokai. They're the artifact spirits of household items that come to life. They're one of the most interesting branches of yokai. There's a couple different subcategories there, but the Tsukumogami are one of the most eye-catching ones, and one of the things that I think appeal to most people when they first see yokai. They sort of come from, in Japan there's this reverence for objects and possessions that we don't have so much in the U.S., where we sort of have a throwaway culture, but in Japan, kids are taught from a very early age to treat their possessions very carefully and, take very good care of everything that they own. And probably part of this has to do with the idea that everything has a soul. Even your old pair of tennis shoes or the old broom in the corner of your house, it has a soul. If you don't treat it right, it might come back and get you in the future. So these Tsukumogami are the household items that sort of got forgotten or fell out of use and sort of come back with a vengeance.
Well, I want to put a pause button on the Tsukumogami discussion just for a moment, because I'd like to go back to that, because I do agree with you that there is a real fun aspect for a lot of people first being introduced to yokai when they see those creatures a lot of times. As scary as some of them can be, a lot of them can be funny and interesting to look at and to learn about. So
just plain bizarre sometimes.
Yeah, really
definitely.
bizarre. So I want to come back to that in just a minute, but before we get too deep into that, I do want to ask you about your books, because you have, if I'm not mistaken, 2 books available at this time, and I want to make sure I get the names of them right. The Night Parade of 100 Demons is your first book.
Yes.
And The Hour of Meeting Evil Spirits is the second book. Both of these books, as I understand them, are almost an encyclopedic-based type of book about yokai, but those are some really interesting titles. Can you walk us through a little bit about each of those books for our listeners and for us to learn a little bit more about those?
Sure. Well, I started introducing yokai to the English-speaking world on my blog, and I did this project called A Yokai a Day, where I would illustrate and tell one yokai story every day for the month of October, sort of as a Halloween thing. And after doing that for a couple of years, people were telling me that they wanted to see sort of a compilation of these, so I began working on The Night Parade of 100 Demons. And the name of that comes from one of the earliest and most interesting yokai encyclopedias written in, I think, 1776 by a man named Toriyama Sekian. He was a yokai cataloger in Edo, back before it was Tokyo, and he basically collected yokai stories from all across Japan, and he put together an illustrated encyclopedia with their names and little short stories about them, usually about 1 or 2 sentences long. And so his first book was called The Illustrated Night Parade of 100 Demons, and so I kind of borrowed that name for my first book as well. It's also the name of an event in yokai lore, which is called the Night Parade of 100 Demons, which is this parade which happens during summer night of all of the yokai and all of the scary monsters in Japan. They go parading through the night, sort of like a big Japanese summer festival, and anybody who witnesses this evil parade will die. So the idea was you had to stay inside on these cursed nights and not look outside and just pray all night. So I thought that was a really cool idea, and I used that for the theme of my first book.
Yeah, now Michael and I have actually used that story in a couple of our live presentations about yokai. We've actually been talking about yokai for 3 or 4 years now in some of our presentations at conventions and everything, and that's one of those, in my opinion, one of those more prominent stories within Japanese culture.
Well, it's also a very common archetype just across the world. It's very similar to the Wild Hunt. Matthew, if you're familiar with that, but it's something that you find almost in every culture.
Yeah, even the word pandemonium literally means all of the demons, and sometimes the Night Parade of 100 Demons is actually translated as pandemonium if you look at older text.
That's actually pretty funny. That's
pretty
cool.
Yeah, and that's kind of weird because I've actually been looking at the word pandemonium for a couple of things for the last few days, so that's going to play into some of my writing in the next couple of months, so it's really interesting. Night Parade of 100 Demons, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, is also a prominent event in one of the yokai movies that's out on the market. One of the older movies, the story leads to that event towards the end. Am I mistaken on that? Yokai Wars or one of those movies?
So there were a few yokai movies created in the late 60s, starting with 1968, The Great Yokai War. And yeah, those are really fun movies, especially if you like old costume movies like that. But at the end, during credits, the yokai all trail off into the night, vanishing as they get farther away from the screen, but it sort of has its own little night parade at the end.
Now, I remembered the title 100 Demons before, the scroll of the 100 Demons before, and I knew about that connection between your book and the older book. Is there a similar connection with the Hour of Meeting Evil Spirits? Or?
With the Hour of Meeting Evil Spirits, I based that on the word omagatoki, which is sort of an archaic-sounding word that means literally the Hour of Meeting Evil Spirits. It's a synonym for twilight, which is when all of the yokai come out, I guess you could say. So I wanted to have another similar concept as the Night Parade of 100 Demons, with the idea that you're going to be meeting a whole lot of monsters here. So I thought the Hour of Meeting Evil Spirits sort of played into that.
Yeah, it's almost like I would liken it unto the fall, like around October time frame in a lot of cultures, sometimes in November, where the veil between the living and the spirit worlds is very thin. And if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, but in Japan, there's an idea that thin veil happens every night at twilight.
Yeah, it happens not just every night, but there's a number of specific times and places where that happens. Particularly with yokai, it happens in the borderlands. So the places where the sea meets the land, or where the mountains meet the valleys, sort of the barriers between civilization and the wild. The border between night and day, or twilight, would also be another big place when yokai can come out. And as far as times of years go, the changing of the seasons are important, but most important of all is Obon, which is in the summer. It doesn't feel like Halloween, but it has roots that are very similar to the ancient roots of Halloween, where it's a festival honoring the dead, and the spirits are able to come back to the world of the living to visit their ancestors. So it sort of has a similar root to Halloween, although it takes place in August, not in October.
That's very interesting. You say the separations between land and sea and mountains, and it seems like Japanese culture, there's quite a bit of respect for the elements and for nature. And to hear you say that there's almost a veil between, let's say, an open field and a forest, or a mountain and a valley, or the ocean and the land. I mean, that's very interesting to me, that they see those veils separating some of those nature elements.
Yeah, you have to remember that in Japan, nature has always been a pretty dangerous thing. They've got earthquakes and volcanoes and typhoons, and the country is completely covered in mountains. So as far as habitable land goes, it's few and far between. So wilderness is everywhere.
That's pretty powerful. And of course, there's a lot of worship of nature and nature spirits as well. And I would say probably because of the fierceness of the nature elements in that country.
Yeah, I think so.
It almost reminds me, we did, I think it was last week we did the episode, no, the week before that, we did the episode on Jack Frost, and we were talking about how during winter, a lot of cultures that live in those colder regions have to kind of worship and appease the winter deity just because of how harsh that deity becomes during those cooler seasons. So I just, based on all the elements and the volcanoes and the earthquakes that you were mentioning, that makes a lot of sense that they would have many spirits associated with those issues.
Yeah, and that comes up in a lot of Japanese folklore, appeasing evil spirits, and that was one of the main themes of the Hour of Meeting Evil Spirits. So when I was writing that book, I was actually consciously choosing some more of the nasty monsters, whereas Night Parade was sort of a conglomeration of all sorts of different yokai and ghosts and things. The Hour of Meeting Evil Spirits has more nasty creatures, and then towards the end of the book there's a chapter on onmyodo, which is the art of sorcery that was developed in the classical period of Japan, and primarily appeasing evil spirits.
So, and I also find it interesting, in a lot of stories from Japan and times past, it seems like a lot of encounters that people have with monsters or demons of any kind happens at night. It's almost like, and Michael and I have joked about this often in our live presentations, that if you want to be safe, if you're visiting Japan, do not be caught on a lonely road at night wandering through a mountain or a field.
Yeah, that's pretty good advice.
Because you're almost certain to come across one of these demons or one of these monsters at some point. It seems like a lot of those stories kind of fall within that twilight period, and that would make a lot of sense, this Hour of Meeting Evil Spirits concept that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think a lot of them, we do start off, when we talk about a yokai, and then we move on to the next one, they always start out with, you can find this one on a lonely road at night by yourself in the mountains.
Yeah, that's a pretty common theme. I think part of the reason for that is that, the key to yokai is that they're mysterious things, and, nighttime and twilight, those are the times when most of us are inside, and if you are outside, your eyes aren't working working too well because it's dark. The shadows play tricks on you. You're by yourself. Some animals come out at night and they make strange sounds in the woods that you can't identify. So there's a lot more mystery at nighttime and twilight in the dark, and that's sort of the key of what yokai are. So they go really hand in hand with that.
That's very cool. Okay, so you've got The Night Parade of 100 Demons and The Hour of Meeting Evil Spirits. Those are the two books that you have on the shelf right now. Do you have anything else in the works at this time as far as books or major projects that you're working on?
Yeah, well, right now I'm working on a Patreon project. Both of the books were crowdfunded through Kickstarter, and that was a really fun way to do them. I got a lot of feedback from the backers while I was making them. I would post yokai and they would comment, and it was sort of a dialogue going as the books were being created. So after I finished The Hour of Meeting Evil Spirits, I wanted to sort of continue that dialogue, so I launched a Patreon project where now every month I'm creating new yokai to put up on yokai.com, and the backers are able to provide feedback. They can ask extra questions or request specific yokai that they want to see, and so I've been able to keep up the dialogue that way, and every month come out with 3 to 4 different yokai. It's been a lot of fun so far, and I'll be continuing that until I've got enough yokai to put out a third book.
I love following your Facebook site and your websites and everything, looking at the new stuff that you put out regularly. It's every time I see Matthew Meyer's art pop up, I get excited and it takes just to sit and check it out.
Thank you.
So tell us, best place to get a hold of your books or get a hold of your art. Where would you send me to find these things for the sake of our listeners?
Best place is Amazon. If you just search for The Night Parade of 100 Demons or The Hour of Meeting Evil Spirits on Amazon.com, or if you're overseas, your own country's Amazon, you can find them. Okay, and what we'll do is we'll actually put those links in the show notes for everybody so it's easy to click on, or just look them up on Amazon, like Matthew said. Let's move on, continue with our conversation about yokai. One of the things Michael and I talk about quite a bit is how creatures or monsters or folklore is similar from country to country. We try to find similarities. It just always seems to me that there's a very unique aspect to yokai and Japanese culture in just a broad sense. Why do you think that yokai and Japanese culture is so unique in the world of mythology and folklore and monsters and demons? Well, I think one of the things that you notice about yokai is that there's just so many of them, and they have such wild and strange characteristics. There are a lot of yokai that are similar to creatures that you find in other folklores, but I don't think any other culture has the sheer number of yokai that Japan has. And that's probably because during the Edo period, in the 1600s through the 1800s, there was sort of a big boom in popularity of folklore. And that happened with the printing press and with sort of the urbanization of Edo during the 1700s, where people became pretty literate, and there was a big demand for books and for illustrated books that could be printed. And yokai were one of the big topics. So during that period, you had a lot of artists who were collecting yokai from around the country and even making up their own yokai. So just the sheer volume of mythical creatures exploded during that time.
And as you said earlier, it just seems like there is an endless well of inspiration for yokai everywhere, at every turn.
And something to almost like, it seemed like they would make up a yokai for every new occasion. So if like their mosquito nets were cut, then there was a yokai for that. If there was a splash on the floor, there was a yokai for that.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think a lot of that can be just traced down to the fact that yokai were a huge source of entertainment for the urban people living in Edo during the Edo period, but also down to the fact that Japan is split up into small groups, so that there's not, up until recently, Japan was a land of different countries practically. I mean, each prefecture had its own idea, or each province had its own identity, and villages had their own identity, and so every place had its own variation of the same yokai. From there, things changed and evolved, so you've got similar stories that are found throughout each prefecture in Japan, but they've all got their own little unique local twists.
I mean, you see that in other parts of the world, and like Ireland and Scotland have very similar creatures, but I never thought of how many different cultures there are within Japan itself, and I forgot that they were pretty separated.
Yeah, even today there's still a lot of regionalization. I mean, you've got different cultural dialects. Some people from parts of Japan say they can't understand the dialects of, other prefectures, and so there's still a lot of regionalization today, but there was certainly more of that in the past.
Yeah, and I think the difference today would probably be the advent of so much technology and access of information that we really see the cross-cultural effect of information sweeping through different regions, and the ease of access to that information and those stories, especially in the West, we kind of tend to say, oh, well, that just comes from Japan. We don't think of the segmentation of culture like you would if you lived in Japan, so we just kind of see it as one big lump of creatures.
Yeah, we do sort of have a monolithic view of Japan when there is a lot of regional differences.
Right. Yeah, so Matthew, if we can, what are your favorite yokai? Or is your favorite? I don't know if you have just one or a grouping of one, but what are your favorite?
It's hard to choose one because there's so many that I really like, but I do get asked that question a lot, so I've had to come up with an answer.
Okay.
And so my favorite yokai is called Ao Andon, and the name means blue lantern, and it's this blue-skinned demon woman who supposedly comes out of a lantern, and she appears at the end of what's called Hyaku Monogatari Kaidankai, which is, it's an old ghost storytelling game. And the idea is you would gather your friends together on a summer night, and you would light 100 candles, and each person would take a turn telling a ghost story. And after each story, you would snuff out one of the candles. And after the 100th candle was snuffed out, there was supposed to be so much fear built up in the atmosphere that a real yokai would appear, and that yokai is the Ao Andon. However, because most people were too scared to do that, they usually stopped the game after the 99th story, and everyone went home. So nobody ever actually saw the Ao Andon.
That is very cool. I really love that. I can see why that would be a favorite.
Yeah, I like the idea of, the story coming to life, and the fact that this has, this is a yokai that was born out of the tradition of telling yokai stories. This is not something that people came up with to explain some sort of natural phenomenon or sickness or something like that. This is something that people came up with while they were in the midst of these yokai discussions, so it's sort of a meta yokai, I guess you could say.
That's really cool. It's almost like Bloody Mary, but with people actually getting together and telling stories as a community thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's interactive storytelling, and I believe, especially in the West, I really truly believe we have nearly lost the art of storytelling. One of the great ways we used to do it was sitting around the campfire or sitting in the community square and acting stories out, and it sounds like the Japanese people still have a sense of great storytelling and interactive storytelling and holding on to those old stories for the sake of either learning a lesson or just having a good time.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's still a lot of yokai popularity in Japan today. I think that's just something to do with the sense of community that they do bring.
Well, and that's an interesting thing that you say there, the yokai popularity, because I see a migration of that popularity crossing the ocean right now. And I don't know if you can confirm this, but I just see some things happening where I told somebody I think I told my wife, and maybe Michael and I talked about it the other day, that I believe within the next 2 to 5 years, yokai are going to take over America and the West. And I really see something swelling in this part of the world with interest in yokai.
Yeah, I definitely agree that's there. Like I said, when I started working on yokai, there was nothing about them at all in English. And since I started working on yokai, a number of other people have also published books on yokai. The word is becoming fairly, not quite mainstream, but it's not really as obscure as it once was. And now we've even got things like Yokai Watch coming to the United States. And pretty soon it's just going to be another, household word from Japan. And it's all happened within just a few years.
Right. I know I have been a lifelong lover and studier of folklore, mythology, and monsters. I had not heard of yokai until I was an adult. And actually, Michael introduced me to yokai in the proper context. I had seen a lot, and I had heard of them, but I didn't know what they were called. And then Michael started teaching me, I think out of his love for Japanese culture, and I think through our studies of martial arts, because Michael and I have studied Japanese and Okinawan martial arts. And Michael, you would always dig really deep into this stuff.
As I could find.
And he'd start coming out with these monsters and these creatures, and I'm like, what is that? He would start telling me stories, and I just fell in love with them. And they're just so unique and interesting, and like we said earlier, just an endless well. And so we started presenting about them, and when we started talking about them at conventions, there were very few people who knew what they were, but everybody loved them when we started talking about them. And now, you mentioned things like Yokai Watch. I just saw displays all over some retail stores the past couple of weeks. Yokai Watch is on its way. I predict it to be another Pokemon in the West,
Yeah, it's lined up to be that. Apparently, in Japan already, Yokai Watch is surpassing Pokemon in popularity, and is now more popular than Pikachu with young children. So I think we're probably going to see something similar to that in the U.S.
That might be fighting words for some people.
Well, it's interesting, too, because while Pokemon doesn't actually have any yokai in it, so to speak, it's very clearly based on yokai. A lot of the Pokemon themselves are directly copied from old yokai, and just the idea of having this long list of strange creatures that you can learn about, that's clearly a direct evolution from the yokai of the Edo period. So in the battle between Pokemon and Yokai Watch, we're really just watching yokai versus yokai.
And like you said, during the Edo period, if I remember correctly, that's actually where a lot of our trading card games come from, the yokai cards that they created in the Edo period.
Yeah, there was a popular card game called Karuta, and they often decorated them with yokai pictures, and that was a very popular way to sell the cards as well, but to get kids involved in these stories.
What is your opinion of things like Yokai Watch, crossing over and really becoming a part of mainstream pop culture? Do you feel like that those type of things capture the spirit and the essence of these stories and these creatures, or do you believe it waters it down at all? Is there awareness that you appreciate about it? How do you feel about that?
Well, I don't think it doesn't water it down or cheapen it, but I definitely wouldn't call it authentic yokai either. But I think it's a good thing. I think anything that raises awareness and, it sort of acts as a gateway into a different culture is good for people. Some people will see Yokai Watch and they'll never have any idea that it's rooted in, an ancient mythology. But other people will see that and they'll wonder, oh, what are these things? And maybe they'll take a closer look at something that they wouldn't normally have had access to if they hadn't seen the show.
Right. So it's not going to do any harm, but at least it's going to be fun for a new generation of people falling in love with the game.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, if it fights with Pokemon, it might do harm. I don't know.
Going back to the discussion of yokai, are there categories we can break yokai down into? Are there certain categories of yokai that are broad and general, or are they literally just all over the map?
A lot of that depends on who you ask. I think there's generally 4 categories you can break them into. Each of these categories has multiple subcategories too, of course. But the first category would be oni, or demons, really, if you want to translate it, but it's probably better just to call them oni. But these are just the creatures that are from hell. They're terrible monsters that exist solely to hurt people. And then you've got a category of vengeful ghosts. These are the onryo and yurei and things that spawn ideas like Sadako from The Ring, or a lot of the Japanese ghost stories that have become really popular. And then for a third category, you've got supernatural phenomenon. So that includes mysterious fireballs or mental illnesses and sicknesses and things like that are not creatures, but they are bizarre occurrences. And then the last category is sort of the broad catch-all of many of its own subcategories, like magical animals or transformed humans or just strange creatures that live in the other world and sometimes come into ours.
In speaking about Tsukumogami, where would you place them in that chart of breakdown?
They would fit into that last group of sort of catch-all monsters, but you could probably make an argument that they're their own group. Tsukumogami were one of the first groups of yokai to really be sort of celebrated on their own. They're some of the oldest yokai that were appearing on picture scrolls as well, and they're part of what spawned the boom of interest in yokai during the Edo period. Some people during the 1400s and earlier began painting these long scrolls of household utensils getting up and dancing about, and that was a really strange idea to people who were just sort of becoming urbanized, and it sprung out, and it just became this own genre of its own.
I mean, to this day, to me, like, when I first started getting into Japanese folklore and saw that group of monsters, that was fun and exciting to me, because, we have poltergeist in the West, but it's not as, it's an invisible creature throwing things around.
Yeah, and when you look at the old illustrations of them, they're really just pure silliness. Even today, they're very funny to watch. Sandals dressed up as horses riding teacups and having jousts and things like that. And it's just such a strange and wacky idea to have these household objects coming to life.
People who listen to the podcast know I like to make a lot of puns, but I appreciate the fact that a lot of those household items, the names that they're given are punny all to themselves. They're based off of, wordplay.
Yeah, and a lot of that has to do with Toriyama Sekien, who I mentioned earlier. When the Tsukumogami were first painted in these old scrolls, they generally didn't have names. The names were added on later by artists, and a lot of those names were invented by Toriyama Sekien, who was a huge fan of puns and wordplay. So he's the one who came up with a lot of these really silly yokai names that have double meanings.
It's very interesting, the contrast with Japanese culture and just this particular grouping of yokai, the Tsukumogami, because here, again, you have these household items. A lot of them have their tongues waggling about, and their eyes are like these googly-eyed creatures, and like you said, sandals getting up and running around, and, lanterns with tears in them become faces, hanging around the house. And, a lot of us look at Japanese culture and say, oh, wow, those people are really serious. They're so reverent and respectful, and think of the dojo scenario where everybody's so strict. But then you have this whole part of the culture that is just taken with these strange little creatures running around the house. And it's such a contrast, and I believe it brings a lot of life to that culture.
It definitely does. Japanese culture definitely does have this image of being very, very stoic and maybe a little bit repressed. But that's right. It's partially true, but it's still a stereotype. And I think that when you spend some time there, you realize that Japanese people also know how to party very, very hard, and they have a very, very strong sense of humor that is reflected in the yokai.
Now, what else can you tell us about this fun and often terrifying group of yokai, the Tsukumogami? Anything stand out to you that you'd like to share with us about this grouping?
Well, one of the most interesting things is sort of the theory about how they got their name. It's sort of a guess theory. There's a number of different ones, but the name Tsukumogami roughly means 99-year spirits. And what this comes from is the myth that with a lot of creatures, after they live 100 years or a certain amount of time, they would become gods, or they would become yokai. So you see that with animals, especially like tanuki and foxes. After they've lived to a certain number of years, they develop magical powers. And so,
like one of Michael's favorite, the kitsune.
Yeah, exactly, yes. So the same idea was applied to household objects. If you used them for 100 years, if they lasted for 100 years, they would gain magical powers and they would gain a soul. And so Tsukumogami is 99-year god, which means they didn't quite make it to 100. Maybe they were used for a long time, but they got thrown out 1 year too early, or they broke just a little bit too early to really reach that status. So they come to life as a twisted and deformed and very silly version of the god that they wanted to be. That's part of the reason they're so silly, and part of the reason that they've got a little bit of a grudge against humans and they want to cause some mischief is because they weren't treated well enough to really make it to gain their full powers, and instead they're these sort of twisted mockeries of gods.
That's actually a really cool idea. That kind of lines up with fairies from Ireland and Scotland that once were gods and were kind of diminished, and so they became kind of similar. They become these impish little tricksters. Mm-hmm. So that's really cool. That's got some depth to it.
Yeah.
I have a quick question about Tsukumogami. There are some people that, they try to explain away household objects coming to life nowadays because you have electricity coursing through those, most of your toasters and hair dryers, lamps. So a lot of people will say that you don't see objects come to life today because of this. Does there hold any truth to that, or is there something else going on there?
Well, it's true that you don't see a lot of Tsukumogami that are electrical objects, but that's mainly because by the time electricity was becoming widespread in Japan, the idea of yokai as an explanation for supernatural events and things like that was sort of out of fad. There was a big push for modernization in Japan after the Edo period ended, and a lot of that involved throwing away superstitions. So the idea of believing in yokai and things like that, it was kind of a national embarrassment in Japan at the time. So there was almost an active push by the government to sort of suppress that kind of stuff. And you didn't really see a big boom in that again until the 1950s, after the war. So there wasn't really active yokai creation going on during that time. And then in the 50s, it was more like rediscovering the old yokai, which had been brushed under the rug, so to speak. But I've definitely seen some pictures by modern illustrators who have shown video game Tsukumogami and refrigerators and televisions. So I don't think there's any idea that electricity or technology interferes with yokai, as there is in other cultures where the idea of technology banishing the spirits of the past is.
It seems to me that you're not going to stop the Japanese people from creating stories. If they want to create a story, they're going to do it, and they're going to do it in fashion.
I think so, yeah.
That's actually a bit of a relief to hear. So you don't think that do you think then that they will continue to create more now that it's not so much a problem, it's more something that seems to be celebrated?
I think definitely. I mean, we can even see that with the fact that Yokai Watch is so popular right now, and the surgence in Japanese horror and ghost stories and things like that. I think that's all, part of this boom that has come back in recent days as well.
Yeah, and that's interesting that you bring that up, because a lot of people would not necessarily associate Japanese horror films with yokai, but indeed it is. Those are yokai that are being depicted in a lot of those horror films.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, everything that you see in Japanese horror movies, they all go right back to a lot of classic ghost stories. I mean, the creepy girls with long hair, women crawling out of wells, all of that, it comes straight out of Japanese folklore.
Yeah, the inky spots up in the corner of the ceiling that is dripping down to the floor, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
One of the things that we talk about a lot on our podcast, and I think I said this a little bit earlier, are the similarities between monsters and spirits in various cultures. For example, vampires in different cultures, or trolls in different parts of the world. Their names, their identifications, their similar actions. Is there anything in the yokai world that you would say, even on a broad scale or an archetype, that would be similar to anything else throughout the world that we could look to and say, hey, I see the similarities there?
Well, sure. I think there's a lot of archetypes that exist in every culture. For example, the Yamamba in Japanese culture is sort of this old, creepy woman who lives out in the woods, and she's almost line for line could be exactly the same as a witch from European culture or, any other country. And they have yokai that perform similar things as vampires, creatures that suck the lifeblood out of you and feed on souls. There's very few creatures that would be one-for-one translations of another culture's monster, but I think you see the same themes in all cultures around the world.
One thing that I notice about a lot of stories that we try to dig into from Japanese culture is they don't always necessarily have a reconciliation at the end of the story. A lot of times stories are just stories for the sake of being stories. But there are, I believe, a lot of stories that drive home life lessons, cautionary tales, share relevant wisdom. Is there anything within the world of yokai that would lead us to a lesson or a consideration of any kind that we could apply to our lives today?
Well, you're definitely right in saying that there's not a lot of reconciliation. Most yokai stories end very badly for the people involved.
I've noticed that. I don't want to be in one of those stories.
I think there are ones that have morality tales, and a lot of it comes down to the origin of the story. So most yokai stories became popular as sort of just scary ghost stories, like I mentioned, that people would tell at these ghost storytelling parties. And those are usually very short and don't have a good ending, and they're just like a quick, weird tale to enjoy. But then a lot of them were picked up and turned into kabuki theater or no theater, and generally infused with Buddhist morality and sort of turned into morality plays where the bad guy is redeemed at the end through prayer and things like that. And of course there's a lot of cautionary tales, don't go off into the woods alone at night, sort of things that parents would tell their children to keep them from misbehaving. Oh, if you do this, the Yamamba will get you. Scary stories like that. So it really runs the whole gamut. There's yokai tales for every purpose.
I would ask, because there is one particular set of stories that seem to share a common theme, but it's a little bit confusing, and I'm wondering if we're missing something just from this culture that doesn't kind of translate over, when we hear the stories in the West. But I think the best one to use as an example would be the Nariona, the snake woman. Mm-hmm. She's shown as washing her child by the river, by the lake, and when you try to go up and console her because she's usually crying or seems in distress, she'll ask you to hold the baby to kind of help out. And when a guy reaches out and holds the baby, she turns into a monster and usually either chokes him to death or devours him or eats him. And I see that happen across a couple of different stories where somebody, at least as far as we see in this translation, is legitimately trying to help, and yet they still get the short end of the stick.
Yeah, that's a common common theme in a lot of yokai stories, and you'll see that not just with Nureona, but there's plenty of yokai that are carrying babies, and once you hold it for them, it turns into rocks and crushes you, or they attack you while you're, unable to defend yourself, or things like that. And I don't know if there's originally any sort of lesson to be had in that. If there is, it would be, just to be cautious of strangers. But I think it may also possibly just be for the sake of entertainment.
And scary stories.
Yeah, a lot of yokai stories were printed and published, so, during the Edo period, and they were...
Penny Dreadful.
Yes, exactly, just like a Penny Dreadful. So a lot of them are in that theme of just a weird tale to pass along.
Matthew, this has been a really enlightening and interesting conversation. Now, what I'd like to do is, if you have one, I'd like to give you an opportunity to share a story, a yokai story, or an experience, or anything that you find relevant or valuable to our listeners at this time. We'd love to hear something from you, from your heart, apart from our questions.
Sure. So I've got a story that it's one of my favorite yokai stories. It's called Oitekebori, and that roughly translates into the drop it and get out of here canal. So this is a story that takes place in Tokyo. Long ago, the village of Honjo is full of canals and waterways, and the canals were teeming with fish. It was common for people to make their living catching and selling fish caught in the moat system of Honjo. One night, two fishermen were fishing in a particular spot at sunset. They noticed that they were catching many more fish than usual, and so they fished and fished, filling their baskets to the brim. After some time, when they caught no more fish, they happily packed up their tackle and prepared to carry their large catches home. Just as they were about to leave, they heard an eerie, terrible voice come up from the canal. "Drop it and get out of here." What happens next depends on who's telling the story. Some say that both fishermen dropped their baskets and fled, and when they returned later that night, both baskets were empty. Others say that they fled home with their baskets, but when they got home and looked inside, there wasn't even a single fish in the baskets. But the most chilling version goes like this. Both of the fishermen turned and fled from the canal. One of them dropped his basket, and the other took his basket with him. The fisherman who dropped his basket ran all the way back to his house and bolted the door shut. The other fisherman didn't get very far. A ghostly hand rose up out of the canal and dragged him down into the water, basket and all, and he was never seen again. So that's one of those examples of stories where it just doesn't turn out well for you at all.
Right.
Very spooky and almost sounds, again, like we were talking about earlier, wanting to appease that evil spirit so, you don't die.
Yeah, and there's hundreds of versions of that story. In some stories it's a ghost. In other stories it's a tanuki who's playing jokes on the people as they fish. In other stories it's a kappa who's playing jokes on people. But their jokes usually end with killing somebody, so they definitely have a different sense of humor than we do.
Well, Matthew, again, thank you so much for your time tonight. Is there anything from your expert perspective on yokai or Japanese culture that we didn't touch on tonight that you would like to touch on or share?
Well, I think just the thing that makes yokai so interesting is the fact that we don't know about them. So a lot of people will ask for detailed explanations or detailed stories and specifics about what can this yokai do or does this yokai have this ability. And I think part of the appeal of yokai is that nobody knows. And there's so many answers, some people will say yes, some people will say no, but they're creatures who are shrouded in mystery, and that's the most important part about them, is the mystery.
Well, very good. Matthew Meyer, ladies and gentlemen, just a fascinating conversation on the topic of yokai, and in my opinion, Michael, a really great podcast to kick off the month of February in our devoted month to yokai and Japanese culture.
Heck yeah, this is, like everybody knows, this is one of my favorite groupings of monsters, and to hear it from a yokai expert and somebody who has gotten down and dirty in the culture, it's freaking awesome.
Thank you.
I would encourage everybody to go check out Matthew Meyer's books on Amazon and his artwork. I'll leave links in the show notes and on themonsterguys.com on our page for this podcast so that you can get to him easily. Please go check out his work. Get his material, because I don't know of anybody better on this topic to tap into than Matthew Meyer. So again, sir, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure speaking to you.
Thanks. I had a great time.
It was such a pleasure speaking with Matthew and gaining his insight into the world of yokai and Japanese culture.
I've been studying yokai just on a personal level of interest for several years now, and there are some things that he answered for me that I just have been kind of trying to wrap my head around for the entire time.
You introduced me to Matthew a few years ago when we started speaking on the topic of yokai, and some of the places we were talking about yokai, people had no idea what we were talking about. And now everybody knows what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And I think their popularity will continue to rise. And people like Matthew will be at the forefront of not just artistic expression, but education and a recapturing of that classical mythology. I'm excited that we got a chance to talk to him and bring some of that to the forefront on the podcast tonight.
You know, I said in our interview that I believe him to be, sincerely, I believe him to be a modern-day folklorist. And I would put him up there with W.B. Yeats and Lafcadio Hearn, you know, some of those classic writers at this point in time.
Yeah, and if you get into his material, and I would encourage everybody to look him up. I believe his website is yokai.com.
Mm-hmm.
And
he also has a blog at MatthewMeyer.com.
Yeah, a blog at MatthewMeyer.com. Look up his books on Amazon.com. We will provide links to all of those in the show notes. You can find him on Facebook. I think I said that. But seriously, folks, follow this guy, get his stuff, because it is amazing. It is really high-level art and storytelling and information about this topic. So, again, I mean, we're just kind of fanboying over here about the fact that we just got to speak with Matthew Meyer.
Yeah, it was really exciting, and it's a great way to start off the month that we're devoting to yokai.
We'll also be touching base this coming week on the kitsune, your favorite yokai and maybe your favorite creature in all the world. I don't know.
My favorite monster, period, yes.
So we're going to go in depth about the kitsune, and we see the kitsune in all aspects of culture right now, and I think even a lot that people don't realize that it's the kitsune they're watching or looking at.
Yeah, the fox spirit, and particularly the Japanese fox spirit, is all over the place right now, even in shows like Teen Wolf, and of course it's prominent throughout anime. It's going to be somewhere. You've seen it somewhere before.
So we've got that coming up. We've got just several good weeks here in February. So very excited about that, folks. Thanks for hanging out with us tonight. Look us up on iTunes. Hit that subscribe button. You can find us in other places as well. TheMonsterGuys.com. Like us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, all that kind of stuff. The Monster Guys. And we'd love to hear from you. Thanks, everybody, for hanging out with us tonight. Good night from the Monster Guys.